Welcome to the Book Podcast, where we discuss books about the book, the Bible, with your hosts, Scott Moffat and Gabriel Penfield.
We go as deep as we can go, look as hard as we can look, but we only scratch the surface of the meaning of the book. We only scratch the surface of the meaning of the book.
Over the years, I've heard many believers diss the idea of investing time and effort in archaeological studies. Many believers have shared with me that they had no desire to visit Israel or biblical places. I'm very hopeful that the time that we share in today reviewing this book, some might have a change of mind about that. This book was written by a man who got the archaeology bug implanted in him as a kid, traveling around the globe with his family and then eventually on his own. This led him to explore many different fields of archaeology. Let me introduce to you Joel Kramer, who pastored a small evangelical church in Utah, where his passion for biblical truth was inflamed. He explored and debunked Mormonism in his first iteration as a writer and filmmaker, and then left that to set off for the nation of Israel and Jerusalem to study archaeology. Joel has firsthand experience in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and and today we examine his book. I hold it up here. Oh, will it show? Where God Came Down, the archaeological evidence. A little bit of background about Joel. He has a BA and a master's degree from the University of Holy Land. He has written 2 books and produced 9 films, which I highly recommend all of them, as well as being the host of the Expedition Bible podcast. Joel lives in Jordan with his family, serves as a professor at Shepherd Seminary. Joel leads tours of the Holy Land and keeps busy with various archaeological projects. I hope I got all that right.
Sound good to me.
let me introduce Joel by asking him about the introduction to his book. In it, you suggest that archaeology is often misunderstood. Can you elaborate on that for us just a little bit as we begin? What is the biggest misunderstanding?
Well, I think, for me, in my experience of going and studying biblical archaeology, just the name biblical archaeology of the field sounds like it's very positive towards the Bible, but in fact, it often isn't. And in fact, biblical archaeology is a secular field, and many people, including myself, don't realize that. And so that can often throw people for a loop, because they're thinking, when they're hearing from biblical archaeologists, that they're going to hear, something very different than probably they end up hearing. So you get a lot of skeptics and a lot of skepticism from the field of biblical archaeology that is dominated by secular scholars who don't believe in this God or the supernatural or miracles. And so it can get very confusing. And so I wrestled through that as a student, and so to try to help people understand that from the get-go, and that to try to say that as Christians, we don't have to sit at the feet of secular scholars to get our information and to understand our Bibles better. That doesn't work very well. And so the hope was for myself, as I learned archaeology, I learned it from a Christian biblical worldview, because that's the worldview that I hold. And when you do that, then it becomes pretty easy to decipher between the biblical interpretations that are based on the historicity of the Bible and the interpretations that are not.
Would it be fair to say that much of the archaeological work that has been done in Holy Lands, holy places, has been done by non-believers who are actually antagonistic towards the scripture, using that as the format of which to base their archaeological discoveries within and upon?
I think that is very fair to say of more recent excavations, but as you go back in time and you get to the much earlier archaeologists that are digging back in the 1800s, early 1900s, then they tend to, this is general, there's exceptions to all of this, but they tend to have a higher view of Scripture, and they tend to at least believe in the historicity of the Bible, and they use it as a tool in their archaeology to reason out, their interpretation. And so, in general, I find if I'm studying a site, I like to go to the earliest archaeologists that excavated that site and read them first, and what they found and how they interpreted it. And then oftentimes the later archaeologists that will come in that are skeptics of the Bible will oftentimes overturn the biblical interpretations that had already been made. And so, yeah, I think that fair to say, especially today. And so there's a lot of confusion because of that comes out of what people are being told from the perspective of biblical archaeologists.
You currently live in a predominantly Muslim country. Do you get any pushback while you're there in what you're doing? Perhaps someone has seen your books. Do you get any kind of, people being against what you're doing because you're a Christian and they're Muslim?
Yeah, I mean, I think where I'm the most exposed as far as that goes is the YouTube channel that I do, Expedition Bible. Those videos tend to be widely viewed and that kind of thing. And so I actually do hear from people that have seen them and whatnot. However, what I'm doing specifically is not political at all.
Right.
I avoid politics like the plague, and
sure.
And don't go there, and just stick to learning our Bibles better, or understanding the evidence for the reliability of the Bible, and stick to those kinds of subjects. And as long as I stay away from the politics and that kind of thing, then I don't think I ruffle too many feathers. But certainly I'm not naive to think that nobody knows what I'm doing or anything like that. But if there was a huge problem with it, I probably wouldn't still be here.
Yeah, and we'll have a little bit more about that in just a minute. In your opening, you use a powerful analogy. You compare archaeology to a jigsaw puzzle. You state the only way to be sure of a site is by comparing it to the Bible itself. The Bible sort of acts like the cover of a puzzle box. Can you elaborate on that for our listeners?
Sure. Just to start, I would say, that the study of Egypt, archaeology of Egypt, is Egyptology of Mesopotamia, Syriology, and whatnot. And then in between Mesopotamia and Egypt is the land of the Bible. And so the archaeology that takes place there is called biblical archaeology, and it's called that for a reason. It's because the most important ancient set of texts that talk about this part of the land are the biblical texts. And so, but it has to be put in perspective of how dependent the Bible is. The worst thing that you can do, and I think it's fair to say that this has been done in the field of biblical archaeology, is to raise archaeology above the Bible. We don't understand our Bibles through archaeology like we understand the archaeology through our Bibles. And so this jigsaw puzzle concept is a 500, imagine a 500 piece jigsaw puzzle that you're missing all but 5 pieces. And now those 5 pieces represent the reality that there once was a whole puzzle. But what can you really know from those 5 pieces about the whole puzzle? You're lost, and there's really not much you can do unless you look at the picture of the puzzle on the box. And then that is what gives perspective and context to your 5 pieces. And you can figure out where they came from and how they fit into the whole and this kind of thing. And so in this analogy, the 5 pieces would be the archaeology and the big picture understanding that the picture on the box provides for the puzzle would be the Bible. And so to use the Bible to understand the pieces of archaeology that are coming up from the ground, because it's about that kind of ratio, about how much of the archaeology that could be done in the land of the Bible that actually has been done in the Bible is right around 1%. I mean, people argue about whether it's 1% or 2% or what it is, but it's a very small number. And so we haven't excavated the entire land of the Bible, but only a small percentage of it. And yet look at all of that's been found that correlates with the biblical text.
Yeah, that's so true. I went to Greece, or Turkey, and was at Colossae, and it's just a big mound. I would have thought it would have been excavated by now, but it hasn't. So you divide your book into two parts. First part is Old Testament sites: Mamre, Mount Moriah, Bethel, Machpelah, and David's palace in Jerusalem. And then in the New Testament, you have holy sites like Nazareth, Bethlehem, where you have Christ's birthplace, Jerusalem, including the tomb of Jesus, the Mount of Olives, and the upper room. Why did you choose? This is the question. Why did you choose these 10 sites? And do you think there's an order of importance in those sites, or was this just random?
Well, I'm pretty good at biting off too much to chew, and so so originally I was going to do a book with that covered 100 sites.
That would be a lot.
And then I realized that was going to take me 25, 30 years, and so I had to find a way to narrow it down. I chose the theme. I chose the theme of where God came down, and of course, there's more sites than the 10 that I cover in the book of where God appeared pre-incarnate, in the Old Testament, and Jesus in the New. And so I tried to focus on that theme, and then also the sites that were kind of related. So, for example, Mamre and the Temple Mount Moriah and Machpelah are all sites, for example, that Herod the Great commemorated for the Jews. And so I wanted to cover those three. Also, 4 of the sites, or where Constantine built his 4 churches that he commissioned during his reign. So I wanted to cover those 4, and so it was things like that. So they do have a connection and a common theme that's going through, and that kind of thing. But yeah, it was let me start with these 10, and then I'll do another 12 in the next book, that kind of thing.
Excellent. The first site is Mamre, as you mentioned, and it's the only Old Testament site that Constantine chose to build a church upon to commemorate the event that took place there. Can you just give a little bit of background to that event for people who might be unfamiliar with it, and why Constantine chose to do what he did there?
Yeah, well, I think it's a couple of reasons. One is his mother-in-law, Eutropia, came to that site and visited that site and was horrified because it had become a pagan worship place, as biblical worship places often did.
Often do.
Yeah, and so she saw the altar there being used by the pagans for pagan sacrifice, and she was horrified, and she sent a description of what she had seen to Constantine, and so that's part of the reason why we got to get rid of the pollution of this site, and build instead there a church where Jesus can be worshiped. But also it was a very clear Old Testament event that takes place at Mamre, where we have the pre-incarnate Jesus showing up with 2 angels and promising Abraham and Sarah that they will have an offspring that will bless all nations on earth. And so it's also because it's a place where Constantine and the early Christians saw that was Jesus who showed up at that site at that time to promise the coming of himself, in that sense, they were building a church, even though it was an Old Testament site in a place where Jesus had showed up and to worship him.
Yeah, most people don't realize that there are a number of locations in the Old Testament where Jesus made, as you said, a pre-incarnate appearance, a number of different forms. So that's really interesting. I had the chance when I went to take a class for my doctorate at JUC to visit the Dome of the Rock and go inside. We saw the stone that's inside the dome, and we got to visit Solomon's stables. Now it's unfortunately not open anymore to non-Muslims. How important, I know this is a little bit off topic, but how important is the Temple Mount sifting project in our understanding and our assurance that Mount Moriah really is what it is?
Yeah, well, the first indicator, as you said, you talked about it being closed now and everything. We're talking about that particular hilltop being one of the, if not the most sensitive place on earth. You depending on who you are, you're not allowed to, not everyone's allowed to visit the site. Even the top of the hill. Many are not allowed to pray at that site. You're not allowed to take your Bible up on that site. And you're always seeing about, things that are breaking out up there, and they can't do much with that site, because anytime they try to, then something breaks out. And so it's a shared holy place, and it's extremely sensitive, which the reason that's the reality is because it's attached to real history and real events that happened in the past that make it that way. And one of the problems with its sensitivity is that no archaeology has ever been allowed to take place on the Temple Mount, on Mount Moriah. And because of that, that's why the sifting project is so important, is because Dr. Gabi Barkai started that, because why not do whatever you can, right? Whatever is possible to do, why not do that? And so where they had made another entrance into the mosque that's underneath and dumped that material out in the Kidron Valley, then he started going through that and having his students and different volunteers go through that. And so they found in that sifting project many different evidences for the different things that happened on the hill. And so, yeah, it's very important. It's also why Mamre is very important, because the site of Mamre, which begins with Abraham, is very similar as far as the site and the history of the site as the Hill Cumorah, which of course also begins with Abraham going up there with Isaac and whatnot. And so, whereas Machpelah, also a patriarch site, has not been able to be excavated, and the Temple Mount Moriah has not been able to be excavated, Mamre has been able to be excavated all the way down to bedrock. And so we can learn something from that about these other two sensitive sites that haven't been able to be excavated. And so the sifting project, and I would say the excavations at Mamre, kind of give us an idea of maybe what would be found if that site could be excavated. But it's an incredibly important site, and it's got a long history that is a purposeful history, because God is over all of history, and it has a lot to do with the redemptive story that history is acting out. And so yeah, going back to Abraham and Isaac and the building of an altar there, which he also built an altar at Mamre, and went to sacrifice his son, and all the symbolism, and where Jesus, the Son of God and the son of Abraham, was crucified in relationship to the hill. All that stuff is very, very significant and profound, absolutely profound. And it's not the archaeology or what you see there that's left over that is so profound. It's what the Bible tells us happened there, and
Yeah,
in the
you
different
tell us
time
that it
periods.
relates to the person of Christ.
Yes,
And why
absolutely.
is that so important?
Well, because it's the events that happen there with Isaac is a foreshadowing event for the coming of the Son of God and the sacrifice that he will endure in order for us to be the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham that one of his offspring will bless all the people on earth, and we are, as believers, part of the fulfillment of that. And so what, in a sense, what Abraham was spared from doing to Isaac, then God himself did with his own son, who was sacrificed in our place. And so that whole atonement concept that comes after, with that being the place of atonement for Abraham and Isaac, and then being provided that ram, is the way that the Lord provided for us in the future, in providing the Son of God to come and die for us. And all the animal sacrifices that took place there, all those years through the temples that stood there, to teach the atonement that then Christ would come and perfectly fulfill. It just,
So it foreshadows what was to come.
Yeah, what a place.
And it is awesome. It's amazing to walk around. Both Abraham and Jacob built altars at Bethel as well. And why did they do that? What's the significance of it? And we learned that God came down at Bethel. What does that mean? How can you explain that to us?
Well, I mean, we don't know for sure some of the details of why and stuff like that, because the Bible doesn't specifically tell us, but we can infer some things, because they were nomadic, of course, with their herds and everything like that. And as Bedouin do to this day, they have their different campsites at different places for different reasons. And then they move in the different times of year between those campsites. And so we see these campsites that Abraham had and the patriarchs had, and we see them moving from the Hebron area to the Shechem area and the Bethel area at different times. And so it seems to be that was the family campsite, that was used generationally. And so we know that they're both described in the same place, where Jacob stops for the night on his way to Haran, and where Abraham is described as being in the hills east of Bethel and between Bethel and Ai. And this site of Bethel fits those descriptions very, very well. And so it would make sense that as Jacob would be going back from Beersheba, one of those campsites, to Haran, then and he stopped at a particular place for the night, that would, and we know that place is right to the east of Bethel, and that the city was named after that place, the Canaanite city. Then it makes sense that that's where he stopped. And then the other thing is Abraham is given a promise by the Lord there, as well as Jacob later being given a promise of the Lord. And if you look at the promise and the details of the promise, it's the same promise.
Right.
Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. It points out the 4 cardinal points, and look around, and I'm giving this land to your descendants forever. And so that same promise, which is now being passed down to Abraham's grandson, happening in the same place, because it's described, geographically as the same place, that makes a lot of sense. And the early Christians commemorated it as the same place. And so yeah, it's and as far as God coming down, it's really interesting, because God came down and spoke to Abraham there. But then when Jacob is first there, then God appears to him in a dream. And that's where Jacob makes his vow. If you bring me back from my trip safely to this place, then I will make you my God. And so then when he's up in Haran, then God appears to him again in a dream. It says, go back to the place of Bethel where you made your vow. So when he goes back to make his vow, that's where God appears to him, not in a dream, but face to face, as he did at Peniel. And so that's where that's where God becomes not just the God of Abraham and Isaac. That's where he becomes the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
House of God. Most believers, even as extensive Bible readers, have no idea the significance of Machpelah. Obviously, it's the burial place of the patriarchs, their wives, and others. And this site is contentious, as you talked about Mount Moriah being contentious. Why is that? And why hasn't there been any archaeological work done there?
Yeah, again, it's a shared holy place amongst different, so at times in its history, it's been a synagogue. At times it's been a church. At times it's been a mosque. And nowadays it's half a mosque and half a synagogue. And you have Jews and Arabs living, Palestinians living very close to each other. And so, yeah, there's a lot of sensitivity to that site as well, which is also why it hasn't been explored archaeologically. And so it's again, it's very similar because we have only 3 sites that are known that has Herodian, architecture that's built at these 3 places. So it seems that Herod the Great built up Machpelah, Mamre, and Mount Moriah to commemorate these biblical places for the Jews. And so,
is there a lot to see there? I've been there to Israel 5 times, and
well, one of those, it's interesting because he built the architecture around, and so for one of them, it's a cave, Machpelah, the burial cave of the patriarchs, and then the other one is Mamre, which is altar, the altar that Abraham built, and then at the center of the Temple Mount is the peak of Mount Moriah. And so they're all 3 commemorating something specific, a cave, an altar, and the top of a hill where another altar was built. And so because the first event that set off that place being then considered by the generations that came after as a sacred ground and a sacred place, and then that was such a long period of time where things changed over and over and over again, then it's difficult to see much of the evidence. The place of those 3 sites, the place by far that you can see it the best is at Mamre. You can see the different layers that are stacked on top of each other. They've been exposed from archaeology. You can see the Constantinian church. You can see what remains from the altar. Not saying that those remains of that altar date to the time of Abraham, but there was an altar that was in use all the way up to Eutropia, the mother-in-law of Constantine, who saw it being used by pagans, and so then it was made into a commemorative altar representing this is where the altar of Abraham was. And so you can see those layers stacked one on top of another, and you see that those layers of commemoration go all the way back to the kingdom of Judah. And so the interpretation of Mater, who excavated there in the early 1900s, interpreted that the Judean king that made the most sense to commemorate this place would have been David, who ruled that southern kingdom for 7.5 years from Hebron, which is right next to that. And so, so you have these biblical interpretations that make sense, and you have that stack of archaeology. And certainly when you're doing archaeology, you don't expect to find anything intact. You don't find intact cities or buildings, or rarely you even find an intact pot. You usually find, a piece of a pot, a sherd of a pot, and that is evidence that there once was a pot. And so when you're doing excavation work, you're not expecting to find whole buildings
No.
or anything intact. You're looking for pieces and portions of the building or their foundations, their foundation walls that you can date and then connect into, the chronological understanding of that site from the historical sources that are available. And it's pretty amazing dynamic when you bring those historical sources, both biblical and extra biblical sources, together with the layers of the archaeology that isn't a city. It's a holy place. It's a commemorative place, or that has a stack of archaeology there. That, in the case of Mamre, what else could it be? What else would it be? Why would there be a Constantinian church there? And then underneath it, a Herodian architecture, and then underneath it, King David architecture. And what else would it be doing there if not for the reality that the events that the Bible is talking about are real events and they really happened, and therefore that's what caused this mound of archaeological layers and evidence to grow over time. If that's not true, if that's really a myth, then what caused all that to grow over time then? Because myths don't have that kind of power on people that they would do that over such a long period of time. It's like a monument of evidence for these biblical events, and the ones that we're not able to explore, like Machpelah and Mount Moriah, archaeologically, are the way that they are now. Their sensitivity, and you can still see an awful lot at the Temple Mount from many different periods, even without excavating, and all the masonry and all the different things. And so it's really amazing. Yeah.
So just the fact that people were worshiping there throughout time is an indicator that this is an important place. They wouldn't be here and worshiping if there wasn't something taking place here, or had taken place here, that they're remembering. So that's how we get to a lot of sites and understand that there is history that took place here.
Yeah.
And back in the year 2000, I visited Jerusalem and walked on a parking lot by the Temple Mount. And it turns out that was the Palace of David, which was partially covered by it. And you talk about the royal tombs, David's tomb, which I've never visited that either in all the times I've been there. Why is David's tomb so ignored?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer to that question is it has to do with politics. That, imagine this, I don't know why it took me so long to understand this myself. But anyways, the archaeology in the land of the Bible is much more driven by politics than it is by the archaeology itself. Much more driven. And so when you're looking at a place like the city of David, so when those tombs of the house of David were discovered, they were discovered by a Jewish archaeologist named Raymond Weil. His last name's probably pronounced Vey, but anyways, he excavated back in 1913. At that time, we're talking the Ottoman period, towards the end of the Ottoman period. Those are totally different politics than later when Kathleen Kenyon came along and excavated the city of David when it was part of Jordan, and not long after it had become part of Jordan. So what you have is you have the Jewish archaeologist Raymond Weil, who is discovering the tombs of the house of David. And how did he do it? He used the Bible. He knew where they were. The Bible told him where they were because of the descriptions in Nehemiah. He went to where the descriptions in the Bible were. He dug a big, giant area, and we don't realize today. They used to move dirt like nobody's business in the past. Nowadays, I would be embarrassed if one of the old archaeologists came up to one of the modern digs, because we don't hardly move any dirt comparative. Yeah, exactly. So he uncovered this huge area. He knew that the tombs of the house of David were in there. and he found all these very damaged in later periods, but these tombs, and he interpreted them as the tombs of the house of David. And that interpretation was accepted at the time because it fit so well. And why wouldn't it be? I mean, this makes sense. And so then the politics changed. And then the city of David, after 1948, in the 60s, when Kathleen Kenyon came there after excavating at Jericho, she was excavating in Jordan, and the political agendas and views had changed very dramatically. And so what she did at Jericho, and then also at the city of David, is overturn the interpretations that had previously been done. Why do I consider the previous interpretations to be better than the later ones? Because the earlier ones were based on the Bible. They used the Bible as a tool for the archaeology to interpret what was found in the ground. That's how they found what they found, is by following the Bible. Why do I not consider the later ones correct? Is because those were, in my opinion, politically driven, and they were overturned for no evidence whatsoever and no good solid reason whatsoever. And as Kenyon said, at that time tourists were going to those tombs as a tomb of the house of David, and so they stopped going there. Why? Because, well, it was in Jordan, and that's not what they were promoting, the people that were showing people around. And that's the interpretation had changed. And so unfortunately also Jewish mysticism has to do with it, and the story that was created in another place, so that the Jews believed that was the tomb of David and so forth. And so this place was forgotten, and people stopped coming there, and they tend to read excavation reports. I don't blame them. It's a good way to go to sleep if you're having a hard time falling asleep at night. But they don't read excavation reports, period, much less ones from 1913 and this kind of thing. And so, and a lot of those excavation reports aren't in English and this kind of thing. And so, and the most important thing is that the Bible says that the kings from the house of David, at least up to a certain generation, were buried inside the city of David. So therefore, the tomb that's outside of the city of David doesn't work. And it doesn't matter that they found other elaborate tombs in Jerusalem, because it specifically says in the Bible that I think it's starting with Manasseh, that they're buried in other places. As the city expanded at the time of Hezekiah, then some of his descendants started being buried in their royal tombs in other places in Jerusalem.
So
but
you're
that
not talking a lot of land there.
No, you're talking a very small, what is it, 4 acres, square acres or so. And so, and
That's
it
kind
says
of a dot. I mean, it's got to be there.
And it says in Nehemiah that, they're rebuilding the wall, and they come up from the pool of Siloam. We know where the pool of Siloam is. And they came up, and I think it was the next section or the section after that went up to the opposite to the part of the wall that was opposite the tombs of the house of David. There was a pool there. They uncovered a pool there, Raymond, while he uncovered the evidence for a synagogue there, which would be a great place to have a synagogue in the end of the 1st century BC, where the tombs of David were. They were greatly damaged later in the building of a later city by Hadrian, Aelia Capitolina, and there was a lot of stone cutting there. But you can still see the footprint of them, and then 2 of them are the best preserved, and the one that's the most monumental is the one that he attributed Raymond Weil attributed to David. Now, whether that one is David's tomb or one of the others, of course, is not known with certainty.
Speculation.
But the idea was that the most monumental one belonged to him. But it's that those are the house. What the heck are they if they're not the tombs of the house of David? Right. And so there's never been a good explanation given for that. But people these days in the field of biblical archaeology have a fit about anything that is biblically interpreted. Like, you mentioned the palace of David that was discovered in 2005 by Elat Mazar. Well, look at what that poor woman went through when she made that interpretation. I mean, everybody came down on her and attacked her for that interpretation, when it is the logical interpretation, because you have the ancient text saying that David had a palace built, and then you have this monumental building at the Acropolis of that city that dates to the time of David. It's
What other conclusion
clear.
could you come to? Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why nobody really wants to step forward and promote the old biblical interpretations these days, because they're so unpopular, and you can't have a career in biblical archaeology if you play your cards and show that you believe in the Bible. So it's like my professor told me, he said, don't even try, because
for biblicists,
people
take the Bible seriously. Should we look at, now, if you were to read some archaeological texts, you'd come away thinking Catherine Kenyon was the preeminent archaeologist and that everything she did was right. Should we take and understand her work with great skepticism because of her views of the Bible and because of the pressures that were placed upon her by the political environment of the day? Should that diss our view of her conclusions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think she's very well known for developing certain methodologies that are still used to this day, but her interpretations, in my opinion, were wrong. And so, when you have a contradiction between the biblical interpretation and the Bible, then come on, don't throw out the Bible.
I'm going with scripture here.
Yeah, doesn't it make a little more sense that maybe the archaeologist is wrong, or even the whole field of archaeology is wrong?
Exactly.
And that kind of thing. And so, yeah, it's and there's many examples like that. And not only do you have the problem of the secular scholarship saying what they're saying on one side, but you also have the sensationalistic claims that are on the other side that often come from within Christianity, that are saying all these crazy things and leading people away from the actual sites that have the actual evidence, that off to all these fantasies. And if the attack against the Bible is that it's fantasy, then you don't want to move off of the evidence into these other sites that don't have any evidence, because then what does that accomplish? And so everybody's got their new idea these days that nobody ever thought.
That's how you get a book written.
Yeah.
I saw a video where someone was suggesting that the Temple Mount really wasn't where it's located. It was really in David's palace. It's just crazy what some people say. Well, let's move on to the New Testament site.
Sure.
Beginning with Nazareth and the so-called House of the Virgin, archaeology by its nature is destructive, is what you say in your book. When the site of the Annunciation was dug after the existing building was removed, I think it was early 1900s, how hard does it make it for us to envision what took place there so long ago? Do we have to have eyes to see, sort of like with David's tomb? How can archaeologists help the unwashed to see what was once really there?
Yeah. Like you said, there was a church that was built there in 1730, and it stood there the entire time that archaeology was developing. And so all the early digs had to dig around that, and it was right over the commemorated spot. So it was over the bullseye of where you really wanted to dig. So I think that was torn down in 1954, and an archaeologist named Bugatti was able to go in and excavate that out. And again, you're not looking for anything intact. You're looking for pieces of and parts of buildings. And so what was found at Nazareth for the New Testament commemorated site is very similar to what was found at Mamre for the Old Testament commemorated site. And that's this incredible layer of this different architecture. First of a Crusader church facing the east, And then underneath that was an earlier Christian church from the Byzantine period that also faced the east. The Crusader church had 3 apses as they usually do, and the Byzantine church had 1 apse. And then underneath that layer was a floor of another building, which has Cairo symbols on it, the symbol of the cross, but it's oriented not east and west like the other Byzantine upper mosaic floor, but that one is oriented north and south, which indicates that it's a synagogue because it points towards Jerusalem. And so the graffiti that was found there showed that it was one of these that are called Judeo-Christian. They're called different things, Judeo-Christian synagogue or church, or a Church of the Circumcision is another that they're called. But basically, the concept that these are Jewish followers of Christ, who, of course, we know were the believers.
So would that be like our Messianic Christians today?
Well, it would be before.
Sort of.
So
Yeah,
it would be before that. It would be before. In these areas, anyways, the Gentile church hadn't come in yet into these areas, anyways, and so so Jerusalem would have been Jewish believers at this time, and Nazareth would have been, and so they worshipped in a building that was more of a synagogue in its architecture than a church. And so, and you see these early depictions of crosses and Cairo and realize they're quite early. And so then you have a mikvah that is all that remains from what the house that once stood there. So there was a house that the mikvah, which is a ritual bath that Jews used, that dates to the time of the event, the time of, the announcement to Mary that she was going to be with child. That's all that remains from the house. You can't see anything else. And then built right over the top of that mikvah where the house was is this commemorative synagogue with the graffiti that shows that they are Christ followers. And then the floor with the symbolism of crosses and Cairo and the first 2 letters of Christ and Greek. And then you have a church built over the top of that synagogue floor oriented towards the east. And then you have a Crusader church. And so again, you have this one thing on top of another, that some event, in this case, a New Testament event, happened, that place then was houses of worship were built one on top of another over a very long period of time, including 1730, which is why they couldn't excavate. Now we're going to tear that down and build a bigger church. Now's our chance to excavate the bullseye. And I appreciate what the Catholics in this case did there, and that they preserved the archaeology that had been exposed there so that when you go into the church, you can see it. And so it's an amazing site.
Let's move to Bethlehem. It's no longer the small village of ancient days, but now it's a bustling Palestinian city. How do we equate the no room in the inn concept with what blows people's minds, because they usually have the creche in mind, to a cave, which served as a guest room in a rural home with a couple hundred people at the most living in it? And what role did Hadrian play in that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one thing when you read that account, kind of with a Western mentality and how we live today in modern times and stuff like that. But when you understand the context of how many people still live in this part of the world, they often cut the stones for their houses from underneath the house. And so they're doing 2 things at the same time. They're making a basement at the same time as building their house. And that basement, which is then a cave because of the way they carved out, or if they find a natural cave, then they'll build their house over the top of it. The reason that's important is it's actually gets pretty darn cold here in the wintertime, and it gets pretty darn hot here in the summertime. And you can't just have your flock your animals out in an open pen all year long. You need to protect them from the sun. You need to protect them from the weather and the cold and whatnot. And so this is a very typical thing, to have a cave as a basement, and to have close proximity between the people living in a house and the animals is also not unusual at all. You know, they argue about whether the inn in that story is describing some place that we would think of as an inn where you're renting the room, or if it's talking about the house itself, that there's no room there. Either way, it doesn't really matter. The reality is that they ended up, it doesn't say in a cave. It's the Christian belief, the early Christian belief, that says it was a cave because the place commemorated as a cave. But it certainly doesn't contradict. There's nothing, and in fact, it makes sense because it's talking about a manger, which is a stone trough that for animals. And if you go into those caves in the houses today, you'll see troughs in there because that's where they feed and water the animals. And so the early Christians, again, we're not talking about different phenomenons happening in different places. We're talking basically about the same phenomenon happening over and over again in these different places. This one thing on top of another. So the commemoration of Nazareth is impressive. The commemoration of Bethlehem and this particular cave as the birthplace of Jesus, and how it attaches to the descriptions we have in the gospel accounts, and how it attaches to the non-biblical sources that we have, like Justin Martyr and Origen, and these, it fits really well. And so they used to use the cave where Jesus was born for their apologetics, right? As they were giving the reasons for why they believed, and the evidence for the birth of the Messiah. And they were using, at that time in early Christianity, they were using this cave as evidence for that. So, and then that tradition. The other thing we have to keep in mind, you mentioned Hadrian,
right?
And not just Hadrian, but Jerome. Jerome lived in Bethlehem, and that's where he did his translation work to produce the Vulgate. And so, and Hadrian came in and desecrated this place, as he often did, because his goal was to take the already existing holy places where Christians were worshiping and then supplant those with his own pagan worship places, so that he could kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, and stop them from being Christian worship places and make them into pagan worship places. And then how once Christianity, got into a place where the persecution was ended by Constantine, and churches could begin to be built, and the early Christians commemorated these places and spoke of the way that they had been polluted by people like Hadrian. And it just shows that Hadrian, when he's doing these things, that they were previously holy places, because why would he choose those places for his holy places if they weren't? So it shows how old these traditions are, these beliefs that this is where Jesus was born, this is where the announcement was made, this is where he was crucified. And we have to keep in mind that Christians lived in Judea from the time of Jesus until today, continually. With in Jerusalem, there was one exception where they left for the AD 70 destruction, which was smart. And then they came back right after that and settled in the city again. And so they're not going to forget where, according to their beliefs at least, the most important events that have happened in human history took place. And they're visiting those places. And that's why, and they're very strongly being used, which is why Hadrian desecrates them. And then that's why they're taken back by the Christians in the early Christian period and commemorated again. And so I would be very skeptical. I'll say this, I would be very skeptical of a place that was an authentic biblical place that did not have a stack of churches over the top of it. much
Like
more
the Garden
so.
Tomb?
Yeah,
Would that be an
yeah,
example?
exactly.
Mhm.
Yep, exactly.
Mhm.
Rather than ones that do.
So for our listeners who might be unfamiliar with it, so would it be fair to say that these places were venerated from the time that Christ or he was born or he died at the tomb and placed in the tomb, the Holy Sepulchre, and those places went through big changes. They built churches on top of them, then they were torn down, and Hadrian or others built holy places for their gods, and then those were torn down, and then more churches were placed. And in that process, in that time, all of the site was sort of desecrated, changed, manipulated, rock was removed. Is that fair to say that? So when you go there, it doesn't really look like what you're expecting it to look like.
Right. It's been changed so many times, and the
Mm-hmm.
stack of archaeology is under your feet.
Mm-hmm.
And most
Mm-hmm.
of these places are worship places for Christians to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're looking at just the church that is there today and the worship that's going on today. And but that has continually gone on all the way back to the time of Christ. And the archaeological remains for that, or the desecration of that, is under your feet in layers that have been in these different places,
Mm-hmm.
excavated and explored and found. And so
Yeah, you really have to have eyes to see. What I found very helpful was they have these flip books where they have a artist rendering and it flips on top of what is currently there and it fills in the picture for you. And that can be very helpful for some folks. I found it helpful.
yeah, and
Well,
I cover some of these things on my YouTube channel, and we put a lot of time and energy into
you
doing
do.
3D models that we
Mhm.
can change,
Mhm.
because like you said, if you don't see it, it's hard to register. And of course, we're showing these whole buildings as they change, but parts of those buildings have been found archaeologically, and then those buildings have been described to us by people who are eyewitnesses that saw those buildings there, whether it's a church or a Hadrian temple or whatever it might be. And so if we
Well, let's
don't
move to
if
the.
if we don't know where these places are, if
Mhm.
people have forgotten where these places are, we don't know anything about anything.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah,
Let's move to the garden in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where
yeah,
Jesus's tomb is located. It looks, like I said, nothing like it did in ancient times. It talks about Mount Calvary as being a rounded mount. Your book documents the changes that took place at these sites from his burial site and his resurrection site. How much of an impact did Constantine's work have on the preservation of this as a holy place, which you've kind of addressed already? And what was his mom, Helena's role in all of this?
yeah. So Constantine was huge. I mean, Constantine has such a bad reputation amongst
Mhm.
Christians. It's kind of crazy. They think all kinds of things about Constantine because they've been taught all kinds of things about Constantine. But the way I look at Constantine, I don't compare him to somebody from an evangelical church. I compare him to the other Roman emperors because that's what he was. He was a Roman emperor. What were the Roman emperors doing during the Roman Empire and during their rule? They were building temples where they were putting up images of themselves to be worshipped by the people of their empire as gods. Constantine didn't do that. What did he do? The church that you're talking about, he raised a church over the place where Jesus was crucified, in a mausoleum over where he was raised from the dead, to encourage people to come and worship Jesus, not Constantine. And so you see very, very dramatic changes at the time of Constantine, that you judge a tree by its fruit. And when you look at that fruit of what he did at that time in those places, that fruit is very good. And so when he won the East in AD 324 in a battle, Then he took control of those sites. And of course, he didn't go around the entire East now and tear down all the pagan temples and replace them with churches, but he went to the critical places. And the one that was the most critical was the place of crucifixion and resurrection. And he raised, and he had completely destroyed the temple and the statue of Zeus that stood over the tomb of Jesus, and the statue of Venus that stood over the Golgotha, the crucifixion place. He had them completely destroyed and removed, and then he built a mausoleum and church over the top instead. And these, of course, then were destroyed and rebuilt over and over again until you get to basically the church that you enter today is mainly Crusader architecture from the later Crusader period. And but yeah, it marks the same place. And then, you don't have to take the traditional places by the early churches, just you can test those places. You can test them with the Bible. That's the most important thing. Does this place fit the descriptions in the Bible? And then you can test them with the extra biblical historical sources and with archaeology. And so these places have been tested that way. And so we know that that where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is today is outside of the city at the time of Jesus. We know in the biblical account that that Jesus, in the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden. And so in the archaeology at where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is today, the evidence for that being used as a garden at the time of Jesus has been found. This is pretty easy to see archaeologically because you have a soil layer and you have the remains of what was grown in that soil. In this case, seeds of grapes and figs and whatnot in the soil there. And so by
I think we have some internet
Josephus.
problem.
Oh,
You're freezing up a little bit. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. And there's a number of other locations that are found in the book that you can go to and read for yourself and study. And I just have a couple of more questions. I think we're okay still. What made you decide to leave America as a lay pastor and pursue archaeology? What was the process that took place there?
Well, as you had mentioned earlier, I was doing outreach media films to try to reach and reason with Mormons with the gospel. And I was finding it being effective to deal with them, not with evidence, whereas here's the evidence for the Bible, where's the evidence for Mormonism, Book of Mormon, and that kind of thing. And so initially, I went there and started interviewing for that purpose. And then it didn't take long until I was in archaeology school. I grew up in the Middle East. That was a part of it too. So I was drawn to that part of the world. And I wanted to learn more about the Bible. And so I wanted to go and study it. And I specifically chose secular scholars to study under because I wanted to get that perspective and understand that perspective where they were coming from. And so, yeah.
How do your kids and your wife feel about your profession, first of all, and living in Jordan?
Yeah, my kids, my youngest, I have 3 kids, and 2 of them are in college, and my youngest is a senior this year here. And so when I first moved them to Jerusalem, that was over 18 years ago. They were all very, very little. My youngest was a baby, and my oldest, I think, was 4. And so they don't really know anything different than living in Israel and now Jordan, and so they don't know how to think about it differently. I don't know, but it was an important move to Jordan for them. They really like living in Jordan. They had a more stable friend base here, because visas are such a problem in Israel that people are always coming and going like crazy, and they had a hard time having friends there, but they've had really solid friends here in Jordan.
I've seen you've included your son in many of your videos on Expedition Bible. So that's good. That's a really good thing. I'm glad you're doing that.
And you and your grandson, right? Yeah.
What projects do you have in the future? Any new books or films? I think you mentioned one earlier that you're working on.
Well, the main thing that I'm doing that keeps me very busy is the YouTube channel called Expedition Bible. And so I'm constantly working on the next video there. I do my own editing. I do all that kind of stuff. So it's it takes me a long time to make a video. But anyways, and then I'm also writing the next book on archaeology. That's basically the next 12 sites continuation of the first book. And so I'm working on that as well. Yeah. So
do you have a website you'd like to promote to our audience? Maybe perhaps thinking of a tour in the future when the land opens back up, hopefully sometime.
Yeah, hopefully. expeditionbible.com is our website. And that's what we're hoping. We're hoping things calm down, but who knows? I don't know.
You never know what's going to happen. The Lord could return here soon.
That's right.
Anything else you'd like to promote or share with our audience?
No, I've appreciated talking to you. It's been a great conversation.
I want to tell you that I admire you. I appreciate you. I love your work. I think you're doing an excellent job, that the Lord's going to have many rewards for you when you eventually go home, as I hope for myself. But I appreciate you and the impact that you're having on the body of Christ. Keep up the good work. Do not tire of it in your labor. Continue to do it. The Lord is blessing. And, I'm feel privileged to have spent this time with you, and maybe we can do it again sometime in the future.
Yeah.
Let me pray for you, Joel, before we leave.
Yeah, please do.
Father, I thank you for Joel. I pray for him, Lord, that you would protect him, keep him safe, help him, Lord, to remain pure and holy, and help him to love his wife and his family, and help him, Lord, to love you more and the church. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
God bless you, my brother.
Hey, God bless you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Book Podcast. If you liked what you heard and want to support us, like, follow, subscribe on any podcasting platform, on YouTube, on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Simply type in @HearTheBookPod, @HearTheBookPod. Thank you. See you next time.